paralyzed little girl was starving, until Hell's Angels biker carried her through the winter. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. It was a freezing winter night in the mountains. The road was slick with snow and ice, the kind of night when most people would rather be tucked in their warm homes. But for Jake Reaper Morrison, a member of the infamous Hells Angels, the open road was his only sanctuary. His motorcycle roared down the winding highway as snowflakes danced in the headlights, the only sound the growl of the engine cutting through the eerie silence. But then, something caught his ear. A faint cry for help. Jake hesitated for just a moment. He was used to dealing with dangerous situations, but he had learned not to ignore a cry for help. Pulling over to the side of the road, he cut the engine and listened carefully. The cry came again, weak but desperate. Jake's instincts kicked in. He quickly dismounted and began searching the snow-covered ground. There, just off the side of the road, he saw a small figure crumpled in the snow. A young girl, no older than 10, lying motionless and trembling from the cold. She was paralyzed from the waist down, her wheelchair overturned beside her. Her clothes were thin, inadequate for the freezing temperatures, and she was clearly struggling to breathe. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had seen plenty of violence in his time, but this was different. This was a child in need. Without thinking twice, Jake ran to her side, his tough exterior softening in the face of her vulnerability. "Hey kid, are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and calm. The girl's eyes fluttered open, filled with fear. She recoiled at the sight of him, the leather vest and patches marking him as a biker. "Please, don't hurt me," she whispered, her voice weak. Jake's heart clenched. He could see the terror in her eyes. To her, he was just another stranger, possibly dangerous. But he wasn't about to let her think he was a threat. "I'm not going to hurt you," Jake said gently, his rough hands reaching out to her. "I'm going to help you." The girl hesitated for a moment, but then she nodded, trusting him, though the fear still lingered in her eyes. Jake carefully lifted her into his arms, cradling her gently. Despite his tough exterior, there was a tenderness in his movements. She was lighter than he expected, her frail body trembling against his. He quickly carried her to his bike, the snow falling harder now, each flake adding to the cold that already gripped them both. "I've got you, kid," he reassured her as he placed her in front of him on the bike, wrapping his jacket around her to shield her from the cold. As they sped down the road, Jake couldn't help but think about the path that had brought him here. The Hells Angels, the fights, the life of rebellion. It had all led him to this moment. He had always lived for himself, but now, as the girl's fragile form clung to him, he realized that something had changed. He was no longer just a biker on the run. He was someone who could make a difference. The road stretched out ahead, winding through the mountains like a never-ending ribbon, but Jake wasn't focused on the distance anymore. His mission was clear: protect this girl, get her to safety, and see her through this harsh winter. But little did he know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. As Jake roared down the snowy road, the wind stinging his face, the girl clung to him, her small, frail body trembling from the cold. The road ahead was treacherous, but Jake's instincts were sharp. He had ridden through storms, fought battles, and faced dangers that would make most people shudder. But this was different. The girl in front of him, paralyzed and vulnerable, had no choice but to trust him. Her life was in his hands. He wasn't sure how far he could take her, but he was going to try. It felt like a burden he had never experienced before, but strangely, he didn't mind. As they reached the small town just off the highway, Jake spotted a gas station with lights still on, the sign flickering in the distance. He pulled over, the cold biting even harder now, and helped the girl off the bike. She winced in pain, but she didn't cry out. She was strong, stronger than Jake had expected. "Hey," Jake said gently, his voice as soft as it could be given the circumstances. "We'll get you warm, okay? Just hold on a little longer." The girl nodded, her eyes still filled with fear, but also a glimmer of trust. Jake knew he had to get her somewhere safe, fast. He didn't have time to dwell on his own feelings of confusion. He was doing the right thing, and that was enough for now. Inside the gas station, an elderly man looked up from behind the counter, his wrinkled face filled with surprise. "What happened to her?" he asked, his voice thick with concern. Jake didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure how much to explain. The girl had been in a bad state when he found her, but he didn't want to scare the man. Instead, he just said, "She needs help. Can you call someone? Maybe an ambulance." The elderly man nodded quickly and dialed the phone behind the counter. Meanwhile, Jake settled the girl onto a bench, trying to keep her warm with his jacket. He could feel her body shivering uncontrollably, the cold cutting through both of them. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the cold. "I'm sorry I scared you." Jake frowned and shook his head. "You didn't scare me, kid. You're just trying to survive. And I'm going to make sure you do." It wasn't the most comforting thing he could have said, but it was all he had at that moment. The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide, searching for reassurance. Jake could see the vulnerability there, the fear, the uncertainty. "You're going to be okay," he repeated, though he wasn't entirely sure it was true. He had no idea what to do next. All he knew was that he had to keep her safe. The sirens of an approaching ambulance sounded in the distance, growing louder as they drew nearer. The girl's expression shifted, her eyes darting toward the door. "I don't want to go to the hospital," she whispered urgently. Jake's heart sank. He didn't know why she was so terrified of the hospital, but it was clear she didn't want any part of it. He couldn't blame her. Something told him she had been through enough in her young life. "Okay," Jake said softly, leaning in closer. "We'll figure this out. But you need to trust me." The girl nodded again, still trembling, but there was a spark of trust in her eyes now. Jake had no plan, no idea where they would go from here, but he wasn't about to let her down. The ambulance arrived moments later, the paramedics rushing inside. "What happened?" one of the paramedics asked, looking at the girl's condition. Jake explained as best as he could, but he was careful not to reveal too much. The girl's past wasn't his story to tell. "We'll take her from here," one of the paramedics said, gently lifting the girl onto the stretcher. Jake watched as they wheeled her outside, the cold air biting at their skin. He stood there for a moment, watching, before following them out to the ambulance. As the paramedics loaded the girl into the back, she looked at Jake one last time. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for saving me." Jake nodded, his throat tight. "Just take care of yourself, kid." The ambulance doors slammed shut, and the vehicle pulled away, disappearing into the night. Jake stood there for a moment, the weight of the situation settling on him. He hadn't known what to expect when he stopped for that cry for help, but he knew one thing now. This wasn't over. The girl's journey wasn't over, and neither was his. He had made a promise to protect her, and he intended to keep it. As the ambulance disappeared into the snowstorm, Jake turned back to his bike. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew that whatever it was, he was ready to face it. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. The next few days were a blur for Jake. He kept a low profile, avoiding unnecessary attention, all the while keeping the girl, whose name was Emily, close by. He had taken her to a small cabin he owned, far from prying eyes, and told her she would be safe there. But the deeper they got into their makeshift life together, the more Jake began to sense that Emily was hiding something. She was distant at times, lost in thoughts she didn't want to share. Her eyes would go dark, haunted by something unspoken. Emily never asked to know Jake's story, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to hers than she let on. The tension between them was palpable, but neither one knew how to bridge the gap. One evening, after dinner, Emily sat by the window, staring out at the falling snow. Her wheelchair was close, but she never used it, preferring to sit in the corner of the room on a chair, out of reach of the world outside. Jake watched her from across the room, his arms crossed, trying to figure out how to approach her. He had always been a man of few words, never one for small talk, but he felt an undeniable need to connect with her, to understand what was weighing her down. Finally, he spoke. "Emily," he said quietly, his voice gruff but soft. "What happened to you before I found you?" She didn't answer immediately. The silence between them stretched long, thick with the unsaid. But finally, she turned her head, her eyes meeting his. They were full of pain, of a history she wasn't ready to share. "I was alone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I thought I could survive on my own, but I couldn't. My parents, they left me. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Jake didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. Instead, he walked over and sat down across from her, close enough for her to feel the warmth of his presence, but far enough to give her space. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "But I need you to understand something. I'm not going anywhere. You're not alone anymore." She didn't respond right away, but Jake could see the way her shoulders relaxed, the way the tension in her body began to melt away. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The next morning, Jake made breakfast, a simple meal of eggs and toast, and when he set it down in front of Emily, she finally looked up at him with a faint smile. It wasn't much, but it was the first real smile she had given him. For the next few days, they fell into a routine, one that felt comfortable in its quiet simplicity. But one night, as they sat together watching the snow fall, Emily's face took on a darker expression. She was staring at the fire, lost in her own thoughts, when she suddenly spoke, her voice low, barely above a whisper. "I don't know how long I can keep running," she said, her voice trembling. Jake's heart sank. He had known that they couldn't stay hidden forever, but hearing the fear in her voice made it all the more real. "You don't have to run anymore," Jake said, his voice steady. "We'll figure this out. But we need to face whatever's coming." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of the future. They both knew that their peaceful life, their quiet refuge, couldn't last. Emily was still a child, caught in a web of circumstances that neither of them fully understood. Jake had promised to protect her, and he wasn't about to break that promise. As the days passed, the cold outside seemed to match the coldness that had begun to settle in Jake's heart. He had always been a protector, but now, he was faced with a new kind of battle, one where he couldn't simply fight his way out. He had to find a way to outsmart the dangers that lurked, to keep Emily safe and hidden from whatever forces were coming for her. The time was coming when he would have to face those forces head-on, but he wasn't ready. Not yet. The sound of a distant engine, faint but unmistakable, broke the stillness of the night. Jake's body stiffened, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun that he kept tucked under his jacket. He glanced over at Emily, who was looking out the window, her expression unreadable. "Stay here," he said quietly, his voice laced with urgency. Emily nodded, her face pale. Jake walked to the door, his heart racing. The sound of the engine grew louder, closer now, and Jake's mind raced as he tried to figure out who was coming. Was it the authorities? A rival gang? Or worse, was it someone from Emily's past, someone who had found her? The footsteps outside the cabin grew louder, and Jake knew that the time had come. Whatever was about to happen, he was ready to face it. And so was Emily. The sound of the approaching engine grew louder, its rumble reverberating through the walls of the cabin. Jake's muscles tensed, every fiber of his being on high alert. He had been prepared for this moment, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure what would happen next. His hand gripped the door handle, his mind racing with possibilities. Whoever was outside, they were close. Too close. He turned back to Emily, who had already moved from the window, her eyes wide with fear. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice low and steady. "I'll handle it." Emily nodded, though her face betrayed her fear. She knew as well as he did that their quiet life was coming to an end. Jake could see the worry in her eyes. She had been through enough already. This time, it wasn't just about her survival. It was about his too. He didn't know what awaited them out there, but he knew he had to protect her at all costs. He stepped quietly toward the door, trying to make as little noise as possible. The footsteps outside were unmistakable now, heavy boots crunching in the snow, getting closer with every second. Jake's hand found the handle, and he pushed the door open just a crack, enough to peer out. There, standing just beyond the threshold, was a figure Jake instantly recognized. It was one of his old friends, a fellow biker from the Hells Angels, though this was no casual visit. The man's face was serious, his expression dark. Jake's heart skipped a beat. "What are you doing here?" Jake asked, keeping his voice neutral but wary. The man stepped closer, his boots crunching in the snow. "We need to talk," he said, his tone cold. "It's not safe for her here anymore." Jake's eyes narrowed. He had suspected this day would come, but hearing the words out loud made the reality hit harder. "Who's looking for her?" Jake asked, keeping his voice low, just above a whisper. The man glanced around, his gaze shifting nervously. "You're not the only one protecting her. But there are people," dangerous people, who were getting closer. The mention of dangerous people sent a shiver down Jake's spine. He had been part of that world for too long to not know what kind of danger they were talking about. "She's just a kid," Jake muttered, more to himself than to the man. "I know," the man said, his voice softening for a moment. "But they'll stop at nothing to find her." The weight of the situation settled over Jake like a lead blanket. He had been trying to shield Emily from the harsh realities of the world, but the truth was unavoidable. The world didn't care how young she was, or how much she had already been through. All that mattered was what she knew, what they thought she knew. And if they got to her first, there would be no telling what they would do. Jake stepped back from the door, his mind racing. "We need to leave now," he said, his voice firm. The man nodded, his expression grim. "It's not going to be easy," he warned. "But it's the only option." Jake turned to Emily, who had been watching the exchange from the shadows. Her eyes were full of fear, but there was a spark of determination there too. She had lived through too much to let fear control her. "Emily, we have to go," Jake said softly, his heart heavy. She nodded, though her face showed the weight of the decision. She didn't want to leave the cabin, the small, safe haven she had found. But Jake knew it was the only way. They had to keep moving. He grabbed her coat and helped her into it, his hands moving with a sense of urgency. "Stay close," he told her as they stepped out into the cold night. The snow was falling harder now, swirling around them in the gusting wind. Jake's breath came out in puffs of white as they made their way through the snow-covered woods. The man from the Hells Angels led the way, his steps sure and steady in the snow. Jake kept a hand on Emily's shoulder, guiding her through the thick snow, his mind constantly scanning for any signs of danger. Every crunch of snow beneath their feet seemed louder than it should have been. The weight of the world felt like it was pressing down on him. The man led them to an old, abandoned truck parked along the edge of the woods. Its engine rumbled to life as they approached. Jake didn't hesitate. He helped Emily into the back seat and slid in next to her. "Get us out of here," Jake said, his voice low, his hand still, gripping the door handle. The truck lurched forward, its headlights cutting through the dark snowstorm. Emily's face was pale in the glow of the dashboard lights, but there was a resolve in her eyes that Jake hadn't seen before. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was fighting back. Jake felt a surge of pride. They weren't done yet. They were still in this together, and that's all that mattered. As the truck disappeared into the night, leaving the cabin behind, Jake knew the road ahead would be filled with more danger, more uncertainty. But he also knew that as long as he had Emily by his side, he could face whatever came next. The journey was far from over. The truck rumbled along the snow-covered road, its tires crunching over the thick layer of snow that had fallen through the night. Jake sat beside Emily, his eyes constantly scanning the road ahead, every shadow and curve in the landscape filled with uncertainty. The man from the Hells Angels sat at the wheel, his face grim, his hands steady on the steering wheel as they sped through the dark. Emily's silence was deafening. She stared out of the window, her breath fogging up the glass as the landscape blurred by. Jake could see the weight of everything that had happened in her posture, her slumped shoulders, the way her hands clutched the edge of her seat. She was still scared, and Jake couldn't blame her. They had been running for days now, and the danger was only growing. He didn't know how much longer they could keep this up, but he wasn't about to give up on her. "We'll get through this," Jake muttered under his breath, more to himself than to Emily. But she heard him. She always did. She turned her head slightly, her eyes tired, but determined. "You promise?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake met her gaze, his heart aching. He wanted to promise her that everything would be okay, but he couldn't. He didn't know if they'd make it through this, or what would happen when they reached the next town or the next roadblock. All he knew was that he would protect her for as long as he could. "I promise," he said, even though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. The road stretched out ahead, long and winding, and the truck kept pushing forward into the unknown. They passed small towns that looked like they hadn't seen life in years, buildings crumbling and abandoned, their windows dark and lifeless. The world outside felt cold, abandoned, just like Emily had felt before Jake found her. But now, she wasn't alone. Now, they were together. And Jake wasn't about to let anything tear them apart. After what felt like hours, the truck finally slowed as it reached a small, secluded cabin on the edge of a dense forest. The man parked the truck and killed the engine. "We're here," he said, his voice low, eyes darting to the cabin, scanning the area for any signs of danger. Jake nodded and opened the door, stepping out into the cold night. Emily followed him, her feet unsteady on the snow-covered ground, but she didn't hesitate. They walked into the cabin, the door creaking as Jake pushed it open. Inside was small but warm, a fire crackling in the fireplace and a couple of chairs around a wooden table. It felt safe, at least for now. But Jake knew that safety was fleeting. They couldn't stay here forever. They were just taking a short breath before the next fight. The man from the Hells Angels moved to the corner, pulling a small bag from under his coat. "You need to get some rest," he said, setting the bag down. "I'll keep watch." Jake nodded, grateful for the man's help. He didn't know how long he could keep going without a break, but they couldn't afford to let their guard down. He glanced over at Emily, who had already taken a seat by the fire, her eyes closed, her face pale from the stress. "You should rest too," Jake said, his voice soft. Emily opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "I don't know if I can sleep," she said, her voice laced with anxiety. "What if they find us?" Jake walked over to her, kneeling down to her level. "They won't," he said firmly. "Not if I have anything to do with it." Emily gave him a small, grateful smile, her eyes softening for the first time in days. She was still scared, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes, and that was all Jake needed to see. He stood up, glancing toward the man who was still keeping watch by the door. "Get some rest," Jake repeated, his voice more gentle now. Emily nodded, though her eyes never fully left him. She wanted to believe him, and for the first time, Jake believed he could protect her. He turned toward the other room, where a makeshift bed had been set up. He lay down, but sleep didn't come easily. His mind was still racing, thoughts of the people after them, thoughts of the promise he had made to Emily. There was no escaping the life they had both been thrust into. He had been a part of a world filled with violence and chaos for far too long, but he couldn't let Emily be a part of it. He had to keep her safe, no matter what. The night stretched on, the wind howling outside the cabin, and Jake lay awake, listening to the sounds of the world around him. He could hear Emily's soft breathing from the other room, and for a moment, he allowed himself to relax. She was safe, for now. But Jake knew that this moment of peace wouldn't last. The world was a dangerous place, and it was only a matter of time before they would have to face whatever was coming for them. But until then, he would hold on to this small, fleeting sense of safety, and he would protect Emily with everything he had. The morning after their arrival, Jake woke to the sounds of the wind howling outside the small cabin, the storm still relentless in its fury. He lay still for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing on him. The fire from the night before had burned low, and the cabin was chilly despite the warmth it had provided the night before. He could hear Emily shifting in the other room, and for a brief second, he allowed himself to think about the calm they had found here, tucked away from the world. But the brief calm was fleeting, and Jake knew that they couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. Not with the people after them still out there, searching. As he sat up and rubbed his face, he heard a knock at the door. He froze, his hand instinctively moving to where he kept his gun. Every instinct in his body screamed to be cautious. Slowly, he rose and walked to the door, his heart pounding. In his chest, Emily was in the other room, her wheelchair parked beside the fireplace. Jake took a deep breath and peered through the small crack in the door. Standing on the other side was a familiar face, someone he hadn't expected to see. It was another member of the Hells Angels, but this one was someone Jake trusted. "What are you doing here?" Jake asked, his voice low and guarded. The man on the other side of the door, Tom, gave a quick glance over his shoulder. "We need to talk," he said, his voice tense. "It's not safe for you or the girl to stay here." Jake's heart raced as he opened the door wider, letting Tom in. Tom stepped inside quickly, looking around as if to make sure no one was watching. "We've got trouble," he said, his tone grim. "The people looking for her, they're getting closer." Jake nodded. He had known this was coming. He had been hoping for more time, but he didn't have it. "What do we do now?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Tom exhaled sharply, his expression dark. "We need to get her out of here. The longer you stay in one place, the easier it is for them to track you." Jake glanced at Emily, who had come into the room at the sound of voices. Her eyes were wide with worry, her face pale. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jake turned to her, trying to keep his expression calm. "We need to move," he said, his voice firm. "It's not safe here anymore." Emily's eyes filled with fear, and for a moment, Jake saw the vulnerable little girl she had been when he first found her. But there was something more in her eyes now, too, something stronger. She nodded without protest, though her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Jake could see that she understood the danger they were in. Tom turned to Jake, his eyes narrowing. "We have a place. It's a few miles from here, off the grid. You can't stay here any longer." Jake didn't hesitate. He turned to Emily. "We're going to be okay," he said softly, trying to reassure her. Emily didn't respond at first, but after a moment, she nodded. "I trust you," she whispered. Jake's heart swelled with emotion. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore. They were in this together. The three of them left the cabin quickly, moving as quietly as possible through the snow. The wind howled around them, the cold biting at their skin, but Jake barely noticed. His focus was entirely on Emily, making sure she was safe. Tom led the way, and Jake kept Emily close, helping her along, his mind racing with everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. They reached the truck in the clearing, and Tom opened the door. "Get in," he said. Emily climbed into the back seat, and Jake followed, his eyes scanning the surrounding woods, still on edge. Tom started the engine, and they drove off, the tires crunching over the snow as they made their way down the road. As they drove, Jake couldn't help but feel the weight of what was happening. Emily was in danger, and he had to protect her. The world outside had changed, and there was no going back. But as long as they were together, Jake knew he would keep fighting to keep her safe. After what felt like hours of driving, they finally reached their destination, a small, secluded cabin deep in the woods. The cabin was even more remote than the last one, hidden away from the rest of the world. Tom parked the truck in front of the cabin and turned off the engine. "This is it," he said. Jake helped Emily out of the truck and into the cabin. It was small, but there was a warmth to it that made it feel like a refuge. They were safe here, for now, but Jake knew it wouldn't last. The world outside was still hunting them. He looked at Emily as she sat down on the couch, her eyes tired but resolute. "We'll figure this out," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. The door to the cabin creaked as the wind howled outside, and Jake knew this was just another temporary stop on the long road ahead. But they were safe, for now, and that was enough. The days that followed were filled with tension and uncertainty. Jake kept a careful watch over Emily, who seemed to have found a fragile peace in the secluded cabin, but the fear still lingered in her eyes. Every creak of the old wooden beams, every shift in the wind, seemed to unsettle her, reminding her that they were never truly safe. Jake, however, was more concerned with the outside world. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. As he sat by the window, watching the snow fall softly against the trees, he thought about their next move. The world beyond the cabin was still a dangerous place. He had promised Emily that he would protect her, but with every passing day, the stakes grew higher. His thoughts were interrupted when Emily entered the room, her face pale and her eyes searching for reassurance. "Jake," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly, "I can't keep hiding like this." Jake stood up immediately, walking over to her. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "We're doing what we have to do," he said, trying to steady his own nerves. "You're safe here. For now." Emily shook her head. "I don't want to be scared anymore. I want to know what's going to happen." Her voice cracked as she spoke, a mixture of vulnerability and strength in her tone. Jake's heart broke for her. She had already been through so much, and now, in this moment, she was looking to him for answers. And yet, he had none to give. "I don't know what's going to happen," he admitted, his voice soft. "But I will do everything I can to keep you safe." Emily met his gaze, her eyes searching his face for something she could hold on to. For a moment, there was only silence between them. Then, she spoke again. "I don't want to live in fear anymore, Jake. I just want to be a normal kid again." Jake's chest tightened. He understood. The weight of everything they had been through was wearing on her, and all she wanted was the kind of life she had lost, the kind of life she deserved. But that life was gone, and there was no way to go back. "I know," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know." But the reality of their situation was impossible to ignore. Jake had made promises, and he intended to keep them, But that didn't change the fact that they were running from something that wouldn't stop until it found them. He pulled her into a hug, holding her close, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on them both. He wished he could give her the normal life she wanted, but the truth was that they were caught in something much bigger than themselves. The sound of a vehicle approaching broke the moment of quiet. Jake immediately pulled away, his hand instinctively going to the gun at his side. "Stay here," he said to Emily, his voice sharp with urgency. Emily's eyes widened. "Jake, what's happening?" she asked, her voice shaky. Jake didn't have time to explain. He rushed to the window, his eyes scanning the area outside. Through the snow, he could see the silhouette of a truck pulling up near the cabin. His heart raced. "Stay inside," he said, his tone forceful now. "Lock the door, and don't come out until I say so." Emily nodded, her fear obvious, but she did as he asked. Jake grabbed his jacket and moved quietly to the door, his mind racing. He wasn't sure who was on the other side of that truck, but he wasn't about to take any chances. The truck came to a stop, and Jake's heart skipped a beat as the engine cut off. The sound of footsteps in the snow followed, and Jake's grip on his gun tightened. He stepped silently toward the door, his pulse pounding in his ears. He wasn't ready for another fight, but he wasn't about to back down either. He took a deep breath, then opened the door slowly, just enough to peer out. The man standing there was someone he had never seen before, a stranger with a hardened look in his eyes, wearing a dark jacket and boots that had seen better days. The stranger didn't seem to be looking for trouble, but Jake wasn't about to trust anyone just yet. "What do you want?" Jake asked, his voice low and steady, trying to gauge the man's intentions. The stranger's eyes flicked to the cabin behind Jake, then back to him. "I'm looking for someone," he said in a calm, almost too calm voice. Jake's instincts flared. "Who are you looking for?" he demanded. The stranger hesitated for a moment, then spoke again. "I was told she's here. The girl you're hiding. I need to take her back." Jake's stomach twisted. This was exactly what he had feared. The people hunting Emily had found them. The stranger stepped forward, and Jake moved to block his path, his hand gripping the gun tucked into his waistband. "You'll have to go through me first," Jake said, his voice cold. The stranger stopped, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, the air between them was thick with tension, but then the man held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I don't want any trouble," he said, his voice calm. "I'm just doing my job." Jake's instincts told him this wasn't just a man doing a job. This was someone sent by forces far worse than he could imagine. He wasn't about to let them take Emily without a fight. The stranger's eyes shifted to the door, his expression hardening. "You don't have a choice," he said. "She comes with me." The tension in the air was suffocating. Jake stood firm, his body blocking the door, eyes locked on the stranger. His grip on the gun tightened, his heart pounding in his chest. The man in front of him didn't seem like a typical threat, but Jake wasn't about to let his guard down. "I said she's not going anywhere," Jake repeated, his voice steady, though the adrenaline was rising within him. The stranger's eyes darkened, a flicker of annoyance passing across his face. "You don't understand, do you?" he said, his tone almost amused. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be. The girl is wanted. She's not safe here." Jake's jaw clenched. He had heard enough. The last thing Emily needed was someone trying to take her away again. He stepped closer to the stranger, his presence imposing. "She's not going anywhere," Jake said again, his voice colder this time. "Not unless I say so." The stranger took a step back, as though weighing his options. "You're making a big mistake," he said slowly, his eyes scanning Jake's face. "I'm here on orders. You don't want to make enemies of the people I'm working for." Jake didn't flinch. He had been in enough standoffs to know that sometimes the best thing to do was to stand your ground. "I've already got enough enemies," Jake replied. "So if you think I'm going to let you take her, you've got another thing coming." There was a long pause, the only sound the howling wind outside. The stranger studied Jake for a moment longer, as if deciding whether to press the issue or back down. Finally, he seemed to come to a decision. "Fine," the stranger said, his tone dripping with contempt. "But don't say I didn't warn you. People like me don't forget when someone crosses them." With that, he turned on his heel and walked back to his truck, his boots crunching in the snow. Jake didn't lower his guard until the man had climbed into the truck and driven off, his taillights disappearing into the distance. He stood there for a moment, watching the truck until it was nothing more than a faint shadow in the snowstorm. His breath was heavy in the cold air, his body still tense from the encounter. He had barely noticed the soft footsteps behind him until Emily's voice broke through the silence. "Jake?" she said quietly. Jake turned to face her, his face softening. She was standing by the door, her eyes wide with concern. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jake's heart ached. He had promised to protect her, but he knew that keeping her safe was never going to be easy. "We're okay for now," he said, trying to offer some comfort, though the truth of the situation weighed heavily on him. "But we need to be ready. That guy won't be the last person looking for you." Emily nodded, her face pale, but she didn't look away. She was stronger than Jake had given her credit for. She had been through so much already, and yet she still managed to trust him. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake walked over to her, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "I know you are," he said softly, "but I'm not going to let anything happen to you. Not while I'm here." She looked up at him, and for the first time in days, Jake saw something other than fear in her eyes. It was a glimmer of trust, the kind of trust that made him feel like he wasn't completely lost in this fight. But he knew it wasn't enough. They couldn't stay in the cabin much longer. The danger was only getting closer. "We need to leave," Jake said, his voice steady again. "It's not safe here. The longer we stay, the more likely it is they'll find us." Emily didn't argue. She simply nodded, her face resolute. Jake knew that the fight wasn't over. It wasn't even close. But with Emily at his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. They quickly gathered what little they could carry, securing the cabin and leaving no trace of their presence. Jake led the way, his instincts guiding him through the snowstorm. The cold didn't matter now. The only thing that mattered was getting Emily to safety. As they moved through the forest, the world around them seemed to close in. The snow piled up deeper with every step, the wind howling through the trees, as if nature itself was conspiring against them. But Jake didn't slow down. He couldn't. Every step forward was a step away from the danger that had been closing in on them. And every step was a reminder of the promise he had made to Emily, to keep her safe, no matter the cost. The journey ahead was uncertain, but Jake knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let anyone take her from him. Not now, not ever. The night was bitterly cold as Jake and Emily pushed through the thickening snow. They had been walking for hours, their progress slow but steady, every step deeper into the dense forest. Jake kept his eyes peeled, alert to every sound, every movement in the distance. The wind howled around them, making the trees creak and groan, but Jake didn't let it distract him. His mind was focused on one thing, getting Emily to safety. Every shadow, every gust of wind, could be a sign that they were being followed. His hand instinctively rested on the gun at his side, though he had no idea how much good it would do against whatever forces were after them. Behind him, Emily was quiet, but Jake could feel the weight of her presence. She was still scared, he could tell. She was trying to stay strong, but there were moments when he saw the vulnerability in her eyes, the fear that threatened to consume her. They were both running on fumes, but there was no stopping now. He had promised her that he would protect her, and that meant pushing forward, no matter how difficult it got. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they arrived at a small clearing in the forest. The snow had stopped for a moment, and the silence was almost deafening. Jake stopped and turned to Emily. She was breathing heavily, her face flushed from the cold, but her eyes were determined. "We can rest here for a bit," Jake said, his voice soft but firm. Emily nodded silently, and they both sat down on the cold ground, their backs leaning against a large tree. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jake watched Emily, noticing how she kept glancing over her shoulder, her eyes constantly searching the darkness. He knew what she was thinking. She was terrified, and he couldn't blame her. "I won't let them take you," Jake said quietly, more to himself than to her. Emily looked up at him, her face drawn with exhaustion. "Jake, what if they find us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake sighed, trying to mask the worry in his own voice. "We'll keep moving," he said, his words almost a promise. "We'll outrun them. We have to." Emily nodded, though her eyes still held a flicker of doubt. Jake could feel the weight of her fear, but he couldn't afford to show his own. He had to stay strong for her. He glanced at the sky, noting the growing darkness. They couldn't stay here much longer. They needed to move again before it was too late. "Let's go," he said, standing up and offering his hand to Emily. She took it without hesitation, pulling herself up from the ground. As they continued their trek through the forest, Jake kept his senses alert, watching for any signs that they weren't alone. The snow crunched beneath their feet, but Jake didn't mind. The noise felt like a warning, a reminder that they had to keep moving. After what felt like hours of walking, they finally reached another small cabin, hidden away deep in the woods. Jake paused, his instincts telling him that this place might be their best chance at safety. He checked the area, his eyes darting from side to side, making sure there was no one around. "We'll stay here for the night," he said, his voice low. Emily looked up at the cabin, her eyes uncertain. "Are you sure it's safe?" she asked, her voice laced with hesitation. Jake nodded, though a part of him wasn't sure. He had no idea who owned this cabin or what kind of people lived nearby, but they had no other choice. "It'll have to be," he said, opening the door cautiously. The cabin was small but appeared well maintained. There was a fireplace in the corner, and the air smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. It felt like a shelter, a temporary refuge from the storm that had been chasing them. Jake closed the door behind them, securing the lock, and checked the windows for any signs of movement. "We can rest here," he said, though his words were tinged with caution. Emily made her way over to the couch by the fireplace, sitting down slowly. Jake sat across from her, his gaze still trained on the door. "Do you think we're safe here?" Emily asked after a long pause. Jake hesitated. He didn't want to lie to her, but he knew he couldn't give her the full truth. "For now," he said, his voice firm. "But we can't stay here forever. We have to keep moving." Emily nodded, though her face showed the exhaustion of the journey. She was trying to stay strong, but Jake could see the toll it was taking on her. She had been through so much already, and he wished more than anything that he could give her the safety she deserved. He didn't know how much longer they could keep this up, but he wasn't about to let her go. "I'm sorry," Emily said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake looked at her, his heart heavy. "For what?" he asked, his tone softening. Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with vulnerability. "For everything," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "For putting you through this." Jake shook his head, moving to sit beside her. "You didn't put me through anything," he said gently. "I'm here because I want to be. I'm here to protect you." Emily sniffed, wiping away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. "I don't know what I would do without you," she whispered. Jake's heart swelled with emotion. "You'll never have to find out," he said, his voice thick with conviction. "I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, there was only silence between them, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. But in that moment, Jake knew one thing for certain. No matter what came next, he would keep fighting. He would protect her, and he would make sure she was never alone again. The morning came with a heavy silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a blanket of snow that stretched as far as the eye could see. Jake stood by the window, his eyes scanning the woods outside, ever vigilant. The cabin they had found the night before had given them a moment of respite, but Jake knew they couldn't stay here long. The danger was still out there, moving closer with every passing day. Emily was asleep on the couch, her body curled up under the blanket, looking more vulnerable than he had ever seen her. He wished he could protect her from all of this, give her the life she deserved, but that wasn't the reality they were facing. He had promised to keep her safe, and that was what kept him going. He couldn't fail her. The door creaked open behind him, and Jake turned to see Emily waking up. Her eyes were tired, but there was something different about her today. She seemed more determined, as if she had come to terms with the journey ahead. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes, and looked around the room. "Morning," Jake said, his voice low. Emily smiled faintly, though there was still a hint of worry in her eyes. "Morning," she replied. She shifted in her seat, pulling the blanket around her shoulders for warmth. She hadn't said much the night before, but Jake knew the fear was still there. "Are we leaving today?" she asked quietly, her voice almost hesitant. Jake nodded, his gaze still focused on the snowy landscape outside. "We have to keep moving," he said. "The longer we stay here, the more dangerous it gets." Emily didn't argue, though Jake could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She was scared, but she wasn't backing down. She had come so far already, and he could see the strength in her that had been hidden before. She was no longer the scared, helpless girl he had found that day in the snow. She was someone different now, stronger, more resilient. Jake stood up and started gathering their things. He moved quietly, his mind racing through all the possibilities. They couldn't afford to be careless. The people who were after Emily wouldn't stop until they found her, and they were getting closer. As Jake packed the last of their belongings, he turned to Emily. "We need to go now," he said, his voice firm. Emily nodded, standing up with some difficulty. She was still weak from everything they had been through, but she didn't complain. She moved toward the door, her steps slow but steady. Jake opened the door carefully, scanning the area outside before stepping into the cold. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the snow. The air was crisp, and the world around them felt oddly peaceful, as if the storm had washed away all the danger that had been closing in on them. But Jake knew better. They had to keep moving. He helped Emily into the truck, making sure she was settled in the back before climbing into the front seat. As the truck rumbled to life, he glanced back at the cabin, wondering if they would ever be able to return. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew they couldn't stay in one place for long. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was the only option they had. Emily was silent during the ride, her gaze fixed out the window. Jake could feel the tension in the air, the weight of everything they had been through and everything they still had to face. They were both tired, both running on empty, but they couldn't stop now. Not when they were so close to something better. They drove for hours, the landscape slowly changing from dense woods to wide open fields, the snow still clinging to everything around them. Jake didn't speak much, keeping his eyes on the road. His thoughts were a whirlwind, wondering how long they could keep outrunning the people who wanted Emily, wondering if they could ever truly escape the danger. After a while, Emily spoke, breaking the silence. "Jake, do you think we'll ever be safe?" Her voice was quiet, unsure. Jake took a deep breath, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. He wanted to tell her that everything would be fine, that they would find peace and safety, but he couldn't lie to her. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we'll keep moving, and I'll keep you safe. I promise." Emily didn't say anything more, but Jake could see the way she nodded, as if his words gave her some comfort, even if it wasn't the answer she wanted to hear. They continued driving, the miles stretching on before them. Every turn, every stop, felt like it could be their last chance. But Jake wasn't going to stop fighting. Not now. Not when Emily was counting on him. As they reached the outskirts of a small town, Jake felt a strange sense of unease. They couldn't stay here, not with the risk of being found, but they needed to regroup, figure out their next move. He pulled the truck over to the side of the road, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of danger. Emily looked at him, her expression anxious. "What now?" she asked. Jake hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "We need to lay low for a while, figure out where to go next. But we can't stay here long. Not with the people looking for you." Emily nodded, her expression resigned but still hopeful. She wasn't giving up, and neither was Jake. He had promised to protect her, and he wasn't going to break that promise. They were in this together. And as long as they kept moving, as long as they stayed one step ahead, they would make it through this. For now, it was enough. The truck engine hummed softly as Jake turned the key, his mind already working through their next move. The road ahead was still long, but they were ready for whatever came next. The next few hours passed in tense silence. Jake kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as the truck rolled steadily down the highway. Emily sat beside him, staring out the window, her face pale but resolute. The small town they had driven through had been quiet, almost too quiet, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They had stayed just long enough to refuel, just enough to blend in with the few cars scattered around the gas station, but the anxiety was creeping back. They were running out of time. The farther they drove, the more Jake's sense of urgency grew. They couldn't keep outrunning the past forever. They had to face whatever was coming. The storm had passed, but another kind of storm was brewing in the distance. "Jake," Emily's voice broke through his thoughts, soft but firm. "Where are we going next?" He looked over at her, seeing the uncertainty in her eyes, the same fear that had been there since the beginning of their journey. He knew she was trying to hold it together, trying to stay strong, but it wasn't easy. "We're going to lay low for a while," Jake said, keeping his tone as calm as possible. "Find somewhere safe. We'll figure things out." Emily nodded slowly, her eyes still focused on the road ahead. She didn't say anything more, but Jake could see the doubt in her expression. She wanted answers, wanted something solid to hold on to. But Jake didn't have any. Not yet. The miles seemed to stretch on forever as they continued their drive, the landscape changing from dense woods to wide open fields and then back into forests. The silence between them was deafening, but neither of them broke it. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to do except keep moving. They passed another small town, the sign barely visible through the fog that had started to roll in. Jake slowed the truck, eyes scanning the area for anything unusual. He was looking for any sign that they were being followed. Nothing. Not yet. But the gnawing feeling in his gut told him they wouldn't be able to keep this up for much longer. They had to find a way to disappear, to vanish completely. "Let's stop for the night," Jake finally said, his voice breaking the silence. Emily turned her head toward him, her eyes wide with surprise. "Are you sure it's safe?" she asked. Jake glanced at her, then back at the road. "We need to rest," he said, his voice steady. "We've been on the move for days." He didn't want to admit it, but they both needed a break. Emily had been through too much, and so had he. They couldn't keep running on empty. He pulled the truck into a small, run-down motel off the main road, its flickering neon sign casting a dull light on the wet pavement. The place looked deserted, just the kind of place they could slip into without drawing attention. Jake cut the engine and turned to Emily. "Stay close," he said, his voice low. "I don't like this place, but it's all we've got for now." Emily nodded, though her eyes betrayed the unease she was feeling. She wasn't used to staying in places like this, and neither was Jake. But it was the only option. They couldn't risk being seen by anyone who might recognize them. They grabbed their bags, and Jake kept his hand near his jacket, where his gun was hidden, as they entered the motel lobby. The place smelled like stale cigarette smoke and cleaning chemicals, the air thick with the scent of something older than the building itself. The clerk, an older man with weary eyes, barely looked up when they walked in. "Room for two?" he asked in a gravelly voice. "Yeah," Jake replied, pulling out cash from his pocket. "One night." The man didn't ask any questions as he handed Jake the key to a room at the end of the hall. "Second door on the left," the clerk muttered, before turning back to his paperwork. Jake and Emily made their way down the dimly lit hallway, the silence broken only by the soft tapping of their boots against the worn floor. The door to their room creaked when Jake pushed it open, revealing a small, sparsely furnished space. The bed was unmade, the sheets yellowed from age, but it was the best they could do. Jake locked the door behind them and turned to Emily. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft. Emily nodded, but her expression was still guarded. She didn't speak, but Jake could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of everything she had been through. She was strong, but even the strongest people could break under the pressure. Jake walked over to the window and pulled the curtains back just enough to peek outside. The night was quiet, but Jake could feel the tension in the air, like something was about to snap. He hated this feeling, this constant unease. He hated the fact that Emily was stuck in this mess. He had promised to protect her, but he had no idea what came next. "We'll figure it out," Jake muttered to himself, more for his own reassurance than hers. Emily walked over to the bed and sat down, her hands resting in her lap. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with silent questions. Jake could feel the weight of her gaze, but he didn't have any answers to give. They couldn't stay here forever. They couldn't keep running forever. But for now, it was all they could do. They had to rest, gather their strength, and plan their next move. Jake sat beside her on the bed, the room still and quiet, the world outside still a mystery. He glanced at Emily, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to hope. They were still together, and as long as they had that, they could face whatever came next. The morning light crept through the cracks in the curtains, casting soft shadows across the room. Jake stirred awake, his body stiff from the uncomfortable bed, but it didn't matter. Every moment of rest felt like a small victory, a brief pause in their ongoing fight to stay ahead of the people chasing them. He glanced over at Emily, who was still asleep, curled up in the corner of the bed, her face calm for the first time in days. It was a fleeting peace, one that couldn't last. Jake knew that. He had to move again. The truck outside was still in one piece, the engine idling quietly, waiting for them to leave. Jake couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long, not with the danger closing in. He rubbed his face, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on him. The promise he had made to protect Emily echoed in his mind, louder than any fear or doubt. He couldn't fail her. He wouldn't. Emily stirred as Jake stood up, the movement enough to pull her from her sleep. She blinked a few times, her eyes slowly adjusting to the morning light. "Jake?" she mumbled, her voice rough from sleep. "Is it time to go?" Jake nodded, his voice low. "We need to get moving." Emily didn't question him. She knew by now that there was no room for hesitation, no time for anything but survival. She pulled herself up from the bed, her movements slow but steady, still weak, but pushing forward despite it. Jake quickly packed their things, throwing the few belongings they had into the truck. He didn't linger, didn't give himself the chance to think too much. They had to go. Fast. Emily climbed into the truck, sitting in the back as usual. Jake climbed into the driver's seat, his eyes scanning the area around them. They couldn't risk being seen, couldn't risk a single person noticing them, even for a moment. The road ahead was long, and they had no idea what was waiting for them at the end. But Jake kept his focus, eyes straight. Ahead as the truck started moving again, pushing them farther into the unknown. As they drove, the landscape began to change, the trees thinning and the snow giving way to barren fields. There was a sense of emptiness in the air, a haunting stillness that made Jake uneasy. Every mile they drove brought them further away from safety, but he had no choice. He couldn't look back now. The weight of the silence in the truck was heavy. Emily hadn't spoken much since they left the motel. She was looking out the window, her expression distant, but Jake knew that she was struggling. The fear, the uncertainty, it was all building inside of her. And he couldn't blame her. He had felt it too. The road seemed endless, stretching on without end. The horizon a distant line that never seemed to get any closer. Jake's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He had to focus. He couldn't afford to lose it now. He glanced in the rearview mirror, scanning the road behind them, half expecting to see someone following. There was nothing. But that didn't mean they were safe. Not yet. The world was quiet, too quiet. And that scared Jake more than anything. They hadn't seen anyone since they left the motel, but Jake knew better than to let his guard down. He had learned the hard way that danger could come from anywhere, and when it did, it hit fast. He had to be ready. After what felt like hours, Emily finally spoke, her voice breaking the silence that had settled between them. "Jake, where are we going?" Her voice was small, uncertain, but Jake could hear the fear there. The kind of fear that spoke of a future she couldn't control, a life she couldn't predict. He looked at her for a moment, his heart aching. He wanted to promise her something, anything, that would make her feel safe. But he couldn't. He didn't know where they were going. "We'll find somewhere," Jake said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty gnawing at him. "We'll keep moving, keep staying one step ahead. That's all we can do." Emily nodded, though her eyes were still filled with doubt. She wanted to believe him. Jake could see that, but she had been through too much to hold on to empty promises. They both had. As the truck rumbled down the road, the wind howling around them, Jake couldn't help but wonder how much longer they could keep running. The danger was closing in. He could feel it, like a storm on the horizon, ready to strike at any moment. But for now, all they had was each other. And that was enough to keep Jake going. Every turn, every mile was a step toward the unknown, but Jake wasn't going to stop. Not when Emily was depending on him. He glanced over at her, and for the first time in days, he saw a glimmer of something in her eyes, a flicker of hope, of trust. She was still scared, but she wasn't giving up. And neither was he. They would face whatever came next, together. The road ahead was long, but it was the only road they could take. And as long as they were together, Jake knew they could survive whatever lay ahead. The miles seemed endless, the landscape shifting from barren fields to desolate stretches of road. Jake kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, the constant hum of the engine a reminder that they were still running, still on the move. The weight of the past weeks, the endless fear and uncertainty, pressed heavily on his chest. Every turn, every stop, felt like it could be their last. They had come so far, but there was still no real safety, no guarantee that they would outrun the people chasing them. Emily sat silently in the back, her eyes glued to the window, her face etched with exhaustion. She hadn't said much since the motel, her mind no doubt overwhelmed with the same thoughts that plagued Jake. She was tired. They both were. The tension between them was palpable, but Jake could feel the unspoken bond, the unbreakable connection that had formed between them during this journey. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a shadowed figure following them. But the road behind was empty, silent. It was almost too quiet. They had to stop soon, not just to rest, but to figure out what came next. They had to make a plan. Let's pull over, Jake finally said, breaking the silence. We need to think. Emily turned toward him, her eyes wide but weary. She didn't argue. She knew he was right. They needed to regroup. They hadn't had a real plan in days, just running, hoping. The next road would lead them to safety. But Jake knew that hope was no longer enough. He parked the truck on the side of the road, the wind picking up as the snow swirled around them. The quiet of the moment was almost suffocating. Jake turned off the engine, the silence settling over them like a thick fog. We need to talk, Jake said softly, his voice carrying a weight that made Emily look at him with concern. She nodded, waiting for him to continue. He didn't know where to start. We can't keep running forever, he finally said. At some point, we have to face whatever's coming for us. Emily didn't speak right away. Her eyes were fixed on the snow falling outside the window, her hands clenched in her lap. Jake knew she was thinking about the same thing. They couldn't keep running. They couldn't outrun their past forever. I don't want to keep running either, Emily said quietly, breaking the silence. But what are we supposed to do? Where can we go? Jake turned to face her, his heart aching with the weight of her question. He wished he had the answers, wished he could tell her everything would be fine, that they could stop hiding and start living. But he couldn't lie to her. I don't know, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. But I'll figure it out. I have to. Emily met his gaze, her eyes searching his face for reassurance. She didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes. She was trusting him, and that trust felt heavier than anything Jake had ever carried before. He had promised her he would keep her safe, but the reality of their situation was starting to hit harder than he had expected. Jake felt the weight of responsibility settle over him again, but this time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like something he would do anything to protect. They were in this together. We'll make it through this, Jake said, trying to convince both her and himself. No matter what happens, we'll face it together. Emily didn't respond, but the way she nodded, the way she looked at him, told him she believed him. For a moment, there was peace between them, a quiet understanding that they had each other, that they weren't alone in this fight. Jake let out a breath, feeling the tension in his shoulders loosen. They couldn't keep running, but for now, they had this. They had each other, and that was enough. After a few moments of silence, Emily spoke again, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. Do you think we'll ever be able to stop running? Jake didn't answer right away. He didn't have the answer. He didn't know what the future held. But one thing was clear. He couldn't keep living like this forever. The people after Emily were relentless, and at some point, they would have to face them head on. But as long as they were together, Jake knew they had a chance. They had fought this far. They could fight whatever came next. I don't know, Jake said honestly, his voice filled with a quiet strength. But as long as we're together, we're not giving up. We'll keep fighting, Emily. You and me. Emily smiled faintly, her eyes still filled with uncertainty, but there was something else there now. Hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They sat in the truck for a while longer, the world outside still quiet. But Jake knew that their fight was far from over. The road ahead was uncertain, but as long as they had each other, they could face whatever came next. With that, Jake started the engine again, the truck rumbling to life. He glanced over at Emily, her eyes still on him, and for the first time in a long while, Jake felt like they might have a chance. The journey wasn't over, but they were still together. And that was enough to keep moving forward.